Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Frazier, and I'd like to welcome you to another program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. This evening's program is a look at Rhinebeck's agricultural history. And I am going to start, actually, not in Rhinebeck, not in Dutchess County, but travel northwards halfway to Canada up to Washington County. And that's where my dad grew up, and he was the last of 7 children on a farm that had been in the family since the Revolution. Here's a Google view of that farm on both sides of Route 22, about 230 acres. You'd have to be crazy not to want to farm this land, right? Well, although his own parents worked pretty hard to convince each of the children that they should all aspire to become farmers, only one of the 7 chose farming, and it wasn't my father. He often said that if anyone wanted to become a farmer, he'd have to be milking every morning, every evening, would never take a vacation. You could hire someone to come in and milk the cows, but even if you had the money to do that, you'd be worried the whole time that he wasn't doing the right job, wasn't doing it properly. And anyway, Dad got drafted during World War II, stayed in the Army for 31 years, and even though he wasn't a farmer, he rarely took a vacation during that time. But when my father decided to retire to a house in rural France, my mother was French, he decided to convert the empty lot that was next to the house into a large garden, much of it planted in sweet corn. His reason was that he couldn't buy sweet corn where he lived in that part of France, and he was appalled that the only reason the French grew corn was to feed animals. No one seemed to know anything about sweet corn. So I used to mail these contraband sweet corn seeds to him every spring, did that for probably about 10 years, and he would persuade the neighbors to taste the corn, many of whom loved this American delicacy, and some thought it was pretty weird, but it became the talk of the town. So I share this family background only to explain the origins of both my own cynicism and at the same time my romanticism about farming. But let's come back to Dutchess County and the town of Rhinebeck and take a look chronologically at the period before European settlement. And the earliest farming in this area was conducted by Native Americans, of course, generally by women. And one of the best sources for understanding indigenous culture, even though he tends to be more interested in fighting than in food, is this book by Ruttenberg, Indian Tribes of the Hudson River. It's a 2-volume work written in 1872. A much more modern publication more specifically focused on Native American agriculture. And this one's from 1939, and it's put out by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Both of the publications, though, point out that the diet of indigenous people in the Hudson Valley consisted largely of corn, squash, and beans, and to some extent, small fruits and apples. So what I'd like to do is to take a look at the first 3 in that group, corns, beans, and squash. They're growing together in this image. Native Americans always interplanted this trio. They called them the 3 sisters because they thrive together, much like 3 inseparable sisters. By the time European settlers arrived in America in the early 1600s, the Iroquois had been growing these 3 sisters for over 3 centuries. The vegetable trio sustained the Native Americans not only physically, but also spiritually. In legend, they were viewed as a gift from the gods, always to be grown together, eaten together, and celebrated together. Each of the sisters contributes something to the planting. Together, they provide a balanced diet from a single planting. As older sisters often do, the corn offers the beans needed support. The beans, the giving sister, pulls nitrogen from the air, brings it to the soil for the benefit of all three of them. And as the beans grow through the tangle of squash vines and wind their way up the corn stalks into the sunlight, they hold the sisters together. And the large leaves of the sprawling squash shade the soil. And when they do that, they keep the soil cool and moist, and they prevent the growth of weeds. And finally, those prickly squash leaves have another benefit. They keep the raccoons away, and the reason they do that is the raccoons don't like to step on those prickles. But there's a fourth sister as well, and that's the sunflower. It attracts birds, keeps them away from the three sisters, and is often planted near the three, but you have to keep some distance because the sunflower seeds, if they're allowed to stay on the ground, in the next season they prevent the germination of seeds planted there. The term is they are allopathic. So this is the version of agriculture that the earliest European settlers of this area would have witnessed. It's a version of agriculture perpetuated by the wisdom of Native American women, and it was based on centuries of experience about what worked here in the Hudson Valley. The earliest white settlers in our town were Hendrik and Annette Kipp, who built the earliest portion of what we would later call the Kipp Beekman Hermant's house. The lintel, by the way, dated 1700, is on display in the Rhinebeck post office. If you walk in the front door, immediately turn to your right, and there it is. The original house was smaller than what we see in this late 19th century photo. They chose this particular location because it was close to the river crossing. The ferry that was run by the Kipp family at the bottom of the hill would last 250 years until the building of the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge. And while I have not seen any evidence that crops and livestock were raised at this location, it would have actually have been extraordinary if that were not the case. When Olin Dowes painted the murals that are in the Rhinebeck post office, a building that's modeled on what this house looked like before it burned down in 1910, he included as one of the murals this scene of Henry Beekman Livingston plowing behind the house. In the text that Dowes wrote to explain the murals that he had painted, he tells us that Henry Beekman Livingston used to put on his pre-revolution court uniform, and my apologies for the fuzziness of this image, but that he used to put on this uniform whenever he plowed in order to display to any passersby his contempt for George III. He had been, prior to the Revolution, an officer in the British Army, of course. While Olin Dowes was right, I think, to portray this site as a farm, my guess is that anyone who wore such a long, heavy coat while plowing behind a draft horse, most likely would have tossed it to the side after the first run. Although this member of the Livingston family often embarrassed his relatives by his outlandish behavior, and this is only one example of it, it's significant that he would get out there and do at least some of the farming himself at a time when others, especially in his own family, might have viewed the profession as below their station. That certainly wasn't the case among members of one of the most prestigious and oldest religious institutions in Rhinebeck, namely what was then known as the Dutch Reformed Church, or today the Reformed Church of America. When they expanded to this current larger building in the year 1808, tradition tells us that they put their farmer members on a comparable footing with members of the church from the landed gentry, when they allowed those farmers to build the rear and east, these two walls, out of fieldstone from their farms. Wealthier members, meanwhile, were able to pay for the brick that was used along the west and the south walls. Those two views I shared with you are from a distance, but even close up, especially with a good dose of whitewash, they look equally impressive. In the eyes of God, whether a farmer or a member of the landed gentry, we are all the same. And while the farmer might not have been able to afford one of the more expensive pews inside the church, he and his family were welcome to worship with everyone else. Slaves even were members of that church. Their pews were located upstairs in the balconies, as far as we can tell from the record. There's a very different farm history, however, at the north end of the town of Rhinebeck, and to understand it, what we need to do is go back to the early 1700s and the Palatine migration to this area. This book by Philip Otterness discusses that migration in considerable detail, and it's a very easy read. Back in the early 1700s, it was Judge Henry Beekman who persuaded some 35 families to settle an area that is just north of where routes 9 and 9G intersect, and where the Palatine Farmstead is located on the east side of Route 9, just north of Rugies. Those families came from a region of city-states in the western part of the Holy Roman Empire, an area that today we call Germany. The most prominent of the city-states was Rhineland-Pfalz. So to simplify things, we tend to lump them together and we call them Palatines. They made up the earliest large-scale migration of thousands of German-speaking people from that region of Europe. Why on earth would they leave? The farm areas that they lived in was very rich land. Why leave a place like that? Well, if we look at a book by Brian Fagan called The Little Ice Age, How Climate Made History, 1300 to 1850, he gives us the answer in that book. I'm quoting from him. Agricultural production in this region declined seriously after 1680 and tumbled disastrously during the cold and wet years between 1687 and 1701. An apocalyptic famine descended on much of northern Europe and France in 1693 and 94. It was the worst since 1661, he tells us. Well, on top of the climate issues that Brian Fagan points out, the French were waging almost continuous war, and the League of Augsburg, that they were fighting against, was responding in kind. And after taking whatever they could from the farmers' harvests as they marched back and forth over their fields, fighting with each other, both of these groups saw fit to tax the locals to support the war effort. As the people caught in the middle, it was too much. The Palatines got tired of all this. So some of them were rural artisans, such as blacksmiths or carpenters or leather workers. Most of them were farmers. They emigrated from small villages, not from cities. They came as families. And they were drawn to America by dreams of inexpensive land, free from feudal encumbrances, and there were so many that they drew attention wherever they were. First in the Netherlands, then in London, seen here in one of the maps in Philip Otterness's book, and later on in New York City, they drew attention. This was a massive exodus of refugees. Jonathan Swift complained about their presence in England. Another well-known author, Daniel Defoe, at the time, also writing in England, wrote a book singing their praises. When 3,000 of them started arriving in ships outside New York City, they threatened to overwhelm a city that at that time consisted of only 6,000 inhabitants. The city refused to let them enter, insisting they stay either in their ships or they could go to Governor's Island. They didn't want them in the city itself. So there they stayed until the ice on the upper part of the Hudson River was sufficiently melted to allow them to debark at what was known as West Camp initially. Today that's known as Saugerties, and East Camp on this side of the river, Germantown up in Columbia County, on property, both sides of the river, that belonged to one family, the Livingstons. The English expected these homeless people to cut down the abundant pine trees on Livingston's land, to sweat those trees for pine tar, which the English needed to build more ships, to expand their navy. They were in a major contest with the Spanish to rule the seas. They needed that pine tar. They were unhappy about having to pay the Norwegians an arm and a leg for it, and they thought they could get it more cheaply this way, through the Livingstons. The English would pay the Livingstons. The Palatines could build their houses. One problem. The pine tar proved useless. The fact that many of these Palatines were experienced farmers or tradesmen meant little to this wealthy Livingston landowner. Because the pine tar had flopped, apparently it just didn't have the right chemicals in it that allowed it to seal those boards in the ships. Whatever the reason, this pine tar operation flopped. And Livingston had no money coming in from the English as a result. So most of the families, these Palatine families, left. Many of them went to the Schoharie and the Mohawk valleys to the north and west, where many of the farms that they established there remain among the most productive in New York State to this day. Others went down to what we now call the Pennsylvania Dutch country, although they were Germans and not from Holland and should be called the Pennsylvania Deutsch country, but that's another story. And those farms remain a model of what agriculture should be. There were also 35 families that accepted Henry Beekman's offer of land in Rhinebeck. And these families were finally able to return to their professions, whether it was farmer or tradesman, and they had been unable to pursue those professions since they had left Rhineland-Pfalz. One of those farms, to this day, along the east side of Route 9, just north of the intersection with 9G, is known as a Palatine farmstead. It's on the town of Rhinebeck tax rolls since 1727. We believe it may date back to even earlier than that, possibly even as far back as 1714. What's remarkable is that this farm stayed in the same family for 8 generations until the death of Catherine Losey about 35 years ago. Catherine was a very hard-working farmer. The more accurate word probably is rancher. Through the end of her life, she was involved in that profession. She judged the 4-H baby beef competition at the Dutchess County Fair for quite a few years. And when she wasn't working to care for her own animals or to take care of her peonies, she loved her flowers, she would work at Ankeny Farm, right closer to the river here. That kind of connection between the Losey family that had been farming at that small Palatine farmstead for 8 generations and the much more impressive and larger Ankeny Farm might seem a bit odd. Ankeny was one of the most prominent Angus operations in the United States, not just in New York State. And they depended on the skills of someone like Catherine to manage their Angus operation. In this publication, it's put out by the American Angus Association, and the year of it is 1957, we see that one of the feature articles in this is by none other than Rhinebeck's own Alan Ryan. He was the co-owner of Ankeny at the time, and most of the other articles, by the way, in this publication are by ranchers in the Midwest or further in the mountain states. So his pitch, Alan Ryan's, to his fellow Angus ranchers is that investing in these cattle is the wave of the future. For many years, Ankeny bulls took top prizes at the international stock shows in Chicago. And it was Catherine Losey that he depended on to get them there safely. Ryan maintained his faith in the future of Angus, but only for a few years after he wrote that article did that faith stay here in Rhinebeck. The cattle operation moved to Montana. Reasons included financial considerations and a desire for what he viewed as less government regulation in Montana than here in New York State. Catherine would continue to help out with what remained at Creed Ankeny until she passed away at the Palatine farmstead as the last remaining member of that family that had been here for 8 generations on that same farm. So it leads me to point out that one of the most important aspects of any business, any family, and especially any farm is the financial aspect. That was certainly an issue with the Ankeny farm. And not only with Ankeny, but especially with a smaller farm. Keeping a careful record of income and expenses is especially important on a farm because the margins are usually fairly thin. And a couple of years of bad weather, an injury to the owner, a disease affecting even just a few animals could mean the end of a farm that hadn't planned for that kind of eventuality. Planning for uncertainty, pinching every penny, being creative about alternate sources of revenue, those are all critical skills if you're going to be serious about being a farmer. Let me look at a number of account books that go a little deeper into this kind of record keeping and why it's important. Rhinecliff resident Jack Conklin recently published his great-great-grandfather John J. Conklin's account book. Here it is. It covers 62 years of financial transactions from 1791 through 1853 for a 220-acre family farm. It wasn't in Rhinebeck, but right next door in Hyde Park, where conditions for farming are really quite similar to what they were and are here. The first recorded sale in this book is of wool and buckwheat in 1793. This is a field of buckwheat. Buckwheat is not a form of wheat, despite its name, but it's the seed of a flowering plant. It's common on colonial farms, but eventually would give way to corn, rye, wheat, and oats. So this farmer also sold hay, $5 for a stack of hay in 1832, when he was also selling a load of wood. We're not sure how much wood that was, but it was a load for $3. In March of 1793, he sold 7 gallons of cider. So what that tells us is that he had apple trees. In fact, Jack Conklin, the author, points out those trees were still producing when he was a boy, growing up on that farm in the 1940s. Some years it was necessary to hire farm workers and even household workers. And in 1828, a month's wages are $9 for a farm worker. The benefit for the worker, of course, is that he could board his horse at no cost. We assume that the workers also got their meals and a bed at no charge, although the Conklin workers were docked pay if they were sick or took any days off. Expenses in that book are as carefully recorded as income is, and every debt is logged until it can be marked paid in full. An unusual source of income on this farm actually was a tailoring business, which Jack Conklin notes was an indication that the women of the household were very active and productive. He points out that the tailoring produced far larger income than the farm product sales. Let's take a look at another Dutchess County farm account book. It covers a shorter time frame, 1824 to 1846, and it belonged to Peter J. Schultz of Rhinebeck, who owned 5 separate parcels totaling 403 acres. That's according to the 1850 Rhinebeck tax roll. The account book shows transactions for farm products quite similar to those recorded by the Conklins in the same period. And an earlier Schultz relative, John F. Schultz, was captain and part owner of a Hudson River sloop. The sloop's name was Farmer. Kind of gives you an indication of what was being carried on that sloop. Craig Marshall, who's sitting right here in the first row, of the Clinton Historical Society. It tells the fascinating story in an issue of the Clinton Historical Society newsletter of the discovery and rescue of this ledger. It gives us the names of local farmers and what they were shipping to New York City from Schultz Landing, right here. Here's the Hudson River, in Rhinecliff. The account includes pigs, apples, cider, flour, and butter. Let's look at another account. The Cookinghams at Primrose Hill Farm is an account of early farming in this area. It was written recently by Noreen Collar and Viola Cookingham in 2010. And again, it's right next door. It's in the town of Clinton, just southeast of us, using data from the extensive agricultural census conducted by New York State in 1875, together with Cookingham family memories. These two authors discuss the wealth and production of 4 neighboring farms. The numbers tell us a lot about life on a small farm in the Rhinebeck area in the mid-19th century. Those 4 families owned, combined, a total of 19 cows and 2 bulls. During the year, 3 of the cows had to be slaughtered for beef. Pork was a major source of meat and income for these families. 2 of the families had large flocks of sheep, slaughtering a total of 4 for meat and producing a total of 120 pounds for wool, 120 pounds of wool. Additional income for these 4 families came from poultry that they sold for meat and eggs. Working horses were present on all 4 of the farms, and 3 of them had a pair of working oxen. Common crops included oats and rye, but only one of the farms grew wheat. Why is that? Well, winter wheat, after all, had been a common crop in the Revolutionary War in this area and in the early 19th century. But what happened was depleted soils and wheat blight, which is a fungal infection, brought an end to the ability of most farmers to grow wheat. Other crops included both corn, again for both human and animal consumption, and apples, which could be turned into cider. Finally, another fascinating collection that tells us much about farming in this area is the Sapasco Farm collection. Many of us know Nancy Kelly, our town historian, who's here with us this evening. Nancy has spent most of her life on her family's farm on this property that straddles Route 308 east of Rhinebeck. This 1786 map that we see in this image is from the New York State Library, and it shows land leased by William Vredenberg from Henry Beekman in 1721. The map notes that the illustrated area, quote, includes farm and adjoining land. The significance of not just this map, but of the collection that we have in the archives here, is that it not only provides a history of this particular farm back to 1721, but the detailed receipts, the invoices, the ledgers provide a very detailed record of what a farmer has to stay on top of. This is a 1917 ledger in that Sapasco Farm collection. Nancy Kelly's parents kept in this ledger a record of sales of egg crates. It's 2 pages, just 2 pages here, from a very long ledger. And it's one ledger of many, many more. Responsible farming requires a lot of bookkeeping, but it's part of what you have to do if you're serious about running a farm. one of the things that Nancy has mentioned is that among these records, going back to the time when there were slaves in Dutchess County, is that there were, we wonder whether any slaves actually were involved in any farming, and indeed they were. There's a record, I believe Nancy told me, that 3 slaves served in the role of agricultural workers as farmers. And Nancy's recently written an article about the Sapasco home farm that is appearing in the upcoming issue, a yearbook of the Dutchess County Historical Society, so you should look for that. Any discussion of the history of agriculture needs to include an organization called the Grange. The Grange refers to itself, as we look at the bottom of this image here, as the Patrons of Husbandry. It's a nationwide organization created in 1867 to support those engaged in agricultural pursuits. It's been in Dutchess County since 1874. It's been here in Rhinebeck since 1900. The Grange initially formed as a lobbying group to seek reasonable controls on railroad transportation costs for farm products. Quite unusual in 1867, when they were formed, was their insistence that women not only be allowed as members of the Grange, but that several key leadership positions must be filled only by women. It's largely because of Grange lobbying that we have rural free delivery and that there are cooperative extension services. They were also strong supporters of temperance, of women's right to vote, and of the election of U.S. senators by direct election rather than by state legislators. Although their numbers have dwindled in recent years, there does remain an active Rhinebeck chapter that's based in Rhinecliff. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the Dutchess County Pomona Grange was one of the most active in the United States. A prominent member was FDR from Hyde Park, who attended meetings from time to time, at some of which even his wife served as a speaker. FDR viewed himself as a gentleman farmer, often spoke of the farming history of his property, and had a genuine farmer's interest in what went on each August at the Dutchess County Fair. Another prominent member from this county at the same time was this fellow, Henry D. Sherwood. Initially a member of the Millerton Grange, he transferred to the Jackson Corners Grange, and in 1921 he joined the Pine Plains Grange. In 1943 he was elected master of the New York State Grange, and at a reception celebrating his election, our own Rhinebeck attorney, Benson R. Frost, described Sherwood as, quote, an ideal man to head our great state organization in these trying times, unquote. It's doubtful, however, that FDR shared those kinds of sentiments, at least not the following year, since it was this Henry Sherwood who led the battle in New York State in 1944 to oppose payroll deductions for Social Security. 4 years later, Sherwood would be elected head of the National Grange. From 1937 to 1946, the deputy state master of the Grange. In other words, the right-hand man to Henry Sherwood was Rhinebeck's E.A. Kuhn, seen seated in the center of this group here. He's the only person wearing a tie in this photo. This is the George Washington pageant in August 1932. It was held at the Dutchess County Fair. Kuhn made his name in the flower industry, was known as the Violet King. Some of us might remember Kuhn's Florist. It was located on Route 9, just below the southwest corner of the fairgrounds, just across from the hospital. Today, I believe it's a pottery studio. And for many years, the biggest industry in the town of Rhinebeck was raising violets, going back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was an industry, and a very large one, here in this community. Tax revenue to Dutchess County from 1909 violet sales, just from that, exceeded $1 million, more than any other source of revenue at that time for Dutchess County. It's true that violets were raised for export in towns other than Rhinebeck, particularly Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie, and Red Hook. The largest production, however, was in Rhinebeck, and it started in 1872 when the brother of the person in this picture, the brother's name was William Saltford, came to America from England and found a job working for William Kelly. The location was William Kelly's estate in Rhinecliff, Ellerslie. Saltford didn't stay long at Kelly's estate. He was hired at the estate of somebody else, S.M. Buckingham, in Poughkeepsie, and Poughkeepsie at that time became known as the Violet Belt, and Saltford as the Violet King. His source of success was that he used greenhouses to raise violets rather than growing them outside. William's brother George, who is in this picture, is credited with bringing violets to Rhinebeck in 1890, rather. This is a book that he writes in 1902, very popular, How to Make Money Growing Violets. But George brings violets to Rhinebeck in 1890, and greenhouses began to shoot up in Rhinebeck's backyards like oil wells in the Western Plains. I'm quoting the Rhinebeck Gazette in 1910. By 1910, the Gazette listed 116 growers in the town of Rhinebeck. The industry would peak at 121 growers with 237 violet houses. Violet growers had to get their flowers to this place on East Market Street. It was Rosencrans American Express. You can just barely read the name Rosencrans up here painted on the window. Once checked in, the boxes were loaded. Each of these boxes would contain recently picked violets. They were loaded on carts that hauled them to the Rhinecliff Railroad Station, and in a few hours they were being sold in New York City. Historians of the Hudson Valley, Carl Carmer is probably one of the better known ones, often wrote romantically about the local violet industry. Here's what he says. An east wind sometimes blows an almost overpowering fragrance of violets across the water. And if you smell it, you will know you are near the little town of Rhinebeck. Unquote. Right here in town, however, an editorial in the Rhinebeck Gazette, January 10, 1903, tells a slightly different story. Quote, "Much annoyance is caused to the residents of this village by the pungent odor with which the atmosphere in many parts of the town was heavily laden for several days during the past week. This disagreeable smell arises from heaps of manure which are being rotted by violet growers for use next season. The manure is purchased in New York, brought to Rhinecliff by car, and hauled by team to the various houses. It is during this process of handling that the air becomes so impregnated with the disagreeable odor. Some chemical or other scheme should be used whereby this disagreeable feature of a business which places on the market the most beautiful and delicately perfumed of flowers may be overcome. The violet growers within the corporate limits will doubtless give the matter their attention and readily find the desired remedy," unquote. Well, by the early 1930s, the industry that had been doing so well started going backwards in terms of growth. Eleanor Roosevelt wore violets that were sent by E.A. Kuhn to her. She wore them at 2 inaugurations and at numerous other public events. And that helped for a while, but by 1956, the village was down to 16 greenhouses, most of them owned by the Trombini brothers. And, picking violets was difficult business. Pickers had to lie down. They had to pick the flowers without damaging them. And they were in danger of burning themselves on these steam pipes that provided heat in the winter months. And the owner's family had to make sure the fire was kept going all night in those colder months. More efficient transportation, however, from warmer climates where soils were hospitable to violets, that was a kiss of death to the industry. E.A. Kuhn, who you saw earlier, was one of the largest operators of violet greenhouses. There were hundreds, however, in the village of Rhinebeck itself, almost all of them small operations. There was a Violet Growers Association here in Rhinebeck, to which most of them belonged. And many belonged to the Grange at the same time. And they were created to support small and medium-sized farms. After all, in the early 19th and 20th centuries, most farms were small to medium. But there were large farms also here and there in New York State. A good number of those exceptions were right here in Dutchess County. Some of those larger farms were actually right here in Rhinebeck. Most of the public, however, didn't view them as farms. They generally thought of them as great estates with mansions and trappings of the rich. One of the best examples of that is right here in Rhinecliff. Building is no longer there. It was burned down in 1949. But most of us know that Levi Morton was a vice president, that he was minister to France, that he was governor, and have seen pictures of his mansion. Few people, however, think of him as a farmer. I spent some time not too long ago researching his political history at the New York State Archives in Albany and at the New York Public Library. And there are extensive collections of Morton material at both locations, There was very little, however, in his own hand. One notable exception to that, however. Among the collections of family photographs, business records, and folder after folder of recommendations for political appointments, there was a pair of very large and very heavy scrapbooks. Levi Morton had put these together with his comments, apparently after his retirement from political office. Predictably, a lot of the material consisted of political cartoons and newspaper stories about his time in political office. What was surprising to me was that at least as much of the material was about his farm. He had clipped story after story about the quality and quantity of milk produced by his dairy cattle, about the awards earned at cattle shows by his prize bulls, about the scientific nature of his approach to agriculture. Ellerslie Farms, this is a 1896 map of that area, south of Rhinecliff, consisted of 1,000 acres fronting the Hudson River. Morton had bought the property in 1877 from William Kelly. He hired H.M. Cottrell, a graduate of the Kansas Agricultural College, to manage his dairy, his crops, his herds, his poultry. Most of the livestock had been abandoned by the late 1880s, and Ellerslie had progressed to become the greatest Guernsey cattle farm in the world at that time. Cottrell's role was to oversee the construction of the barn, and this is a section of that 1896 map showing the barn at the upper right here, 300 feet long and L-shaped with this additional addition up here. At the time, it was one of the most costly barn constructions undertaken in the entire country. Here is a bluish picture of the barn that comes from the collection at the Morton Library in Rhinecliff. This barn, I believe this photograph is from about 1893. This barn replaced an earlier, much smaller one that had burned after being struck by lightning. The one in this picture winds up burning down as well, about a year after its construction. And within a day after that fire, Levi Morton directed that it be rebuilt exactly as before, with one change, that there be a 24-hour watchman on site. He wanted to be sure that if any fires broke out or anything strange happened, that it could be addressed immediately. So the barn included space for up to 400 cows, a modern laboratory, a ventilation system that allowed for experiments with non-grazing cows. Morton's farm started with 180 cows and bulls of a stock that he had imported in 1887 from the island of Guernsey. As the model farm for the modern era, the vice president was able to represent himself as a farmer whose personal investments helped lead to innovative techniques in dairy production. Cows could be seen grazing in his fields, but look closely. And what you see is that it's only the young ones that are out there grazing in the fields. One of the innovative techniques that Cottrell came up with was the retention of milk-giving cows, young cows, heifers, do not produce milk yet. But the milk-giving cows would be kept in stalls inside that barn night and day for months at a time. They didn't go outside. Cows were turned into artificial machines, fed with food and water, kept in a state of quiet for the purpose of producing the highest yield of the richest milk. And also, as Guernseys, producing much better butterfat content than other kinds of milk-producing cows. 5 of Morton's Guernseys were shown at the Chicago World's Fair as the stock of the future. Cottrell also invented new ways to produce butter and cream. The poultry department sent to market 500 artificially incubated chickens every week. Ellerslie milk was famous in New York City, but it cost a lot to make it. Morton's biographer, his name is Robert McElroy, in a book published, I believe, in the 1920s, quotes Morton as having said, "I serve milk alternately with champagne. One costs the same as the other." A New York Times article, December 2nd, 1906, discusses what it calls drastic new measures now in effect to protect New York City residents from contaminated milk. This was in response to an unacceptable number of deaths from typhoid and tuberculosis that were traced to contaminated milk from sick cows. After 1,000 inspections conducted by the New York City Board of Health in 1906 in 543 creameries across 7 states that had been sending milk for sale in New York City, the Board of Health disapproved 1 out of 5. They disapproved 100 creameries. The result, of course, was increased demand from the approved sources to supply this 600 million quarts of milk that the New York Times in that article estimated is consumed annually in New York City. What's most interesting in that article is that they list the largest suppliers to New York City of milk. Number 2 is Ellerslie Farms. Even more interesting is that 4 other Dutchess County farms are among the top 10. 2 of them are in Hyde Park, the Locusts in Statsburg, Hornsby's in Red Hook, Rokeby, and the 4th in that list that's here in Dutchess County is John Jacob Astor's Ferncliff. So what I'd like to do is to turn to Ferncliff, and like Ellerslie, this was another place that was viewed by the public as the warmer weather home of one of America's wealthiest families. Here's a map of that property, and it shows how many crop and animal-related sites were on that property. And here is a tax list from the 1930s. It's actually the assessment roll for the town of Rhinebeck, December 22nd, 1931. And it shows how the Astors had put Ferncliff together by acquiring numerous smaller farms originally on their periphery. By the way, we recently received from the author, Matt Verrilli, a 2-volume set titled The Millionaires, and it is about the history of Ferncliff. Fascinating book. It will be available, we expect, for the public. Unfortunately, we can't let it be taken out, but it will be in the local history room. So the Astors, in fact, wanted this property to have privacy, but they were indeed very serious about their role in agriculture, even though they were much better known for their clever, if not always ethical, ownership of New York City real estate. The press during the mid to late 19th century printed numerous stories critical of the horrible conditions in many Astor-owned buildings, tenement buildings in the slums of New York City. The most common Astor defense was that the Astors were merely the owners. Improvements are up to the managers to whom they leased the buildings. And if the managers chose to spend too little on improvements, why, the press ought to go after the managers, not us, the Astors, as the owners. Well, be that as it may, in the area of milk production, however, the Astors made sure that conditions were as perfect as possible. And they spent top dollar to make sure of that. The architects and contractors hired by John Jacob Astor to design and build the dairy barns right here created state-of-the-art ventilation systems, seen here, electrical systems, plumbing, and waste disposal. They were more fit for kings than for cattle, and stood in remarkable contrast to the conditions in the Astor real estate holdings in New York City. Let me turn to another of the magnificent estates on the river that also serve the role of a farm, and that's Linwood. It dated to the 18th century and was the home of Thomas Tillotson. He was Surgeon General to George Washington. By the late 19th century, it had become the property of Rupert Schauk. He was best known as the owner of Knickerbocker and Rupert Beer, and the Yankees owner who persuaded Babe Ruth to leave Boston. He tore down the original mansion, built a newer one, labeled on this map up here near the top. What's more remarkable on this map, however, are the buildings devoted to raising animals. Linwood operated as a major agricultural site. The mansion is gone. It was used by several local fire departments as a controlled fire site when the Sisters of St. Ursula realized it would be less expensive to tear it down and build a new building than to try to maintain a decaying structure. The main barn is visible here from South Mill Road as you look toward the Hudson while crossing the bridge that goes across the Landsman's Kill. The current owner seems to be maintaining that barn in pretty good condition, but most of the other farm buildings are no longer serving their original purpose. Most of them have been torn down quite a long time ago. Well, today, just west of this library, is the Scholdorf Dairy Farm. It's still hanging on. I'm not sure just how it's doing that. The popularity of the farmers market here in the village of Rhinebeck is certainly a hopeful sign. Farming, however, whether on the large scale of Ellerslie or one of the other great estates, or the more modest Cookingham, it's a tough business. It may look attractive, especially from a distance, but success in that enterprise requires an enormous commitment of patience, of money, and of time. we're fortunate here in Rhinebeck that there have been many in our community willing to make that kind of commitment, and that a few are still hard at it. I'm going to conclude there and set aside some time for questions. Thank you all very much.